Tears of the Kingdom is finally here, and it's incredible. Faced with the impossible task of living up to Breath of the Wild's legendary status, Zelda fans like myself wondered if this title could truly deliver a worthy follow-up experience. Could a sequel that reuses the same map and assets from its predecessor still recapture that sense of wonder and discovery? How would this game establish its own legacy? Well, by almost any metric, Tears of the Kingdom has over-delivered on that goal. But how is this possible? How did Tears of Kingdom surpass its predecessor? As I played through the game and contemplated this very question, I ended up compiling a list of 10 specific ways I think this sequel surpasses the original. And yes, this list is loosely ranked in order. Please remember to hit subscribe and support this content. Now, I also want to call out that this is not just a general list of the top 10 best things about Tears of the Kingdom, although many items on this list could also serve that purpose. Instead, we're going to specifically examine 10 aspects of Tears of the Kingdom that also existed in Breath of the Wild and how they have been fixed or improved upon in the sequel. As a warning, there are minor and moderate gameplay spoilers ahead, but nothing significant pertaining to the story. With that said, it's time for a Crywolf countdown. Starting with number 10, let's discuss the audio. Now, Breath of the Wild certainly delivered a memorable soundtrack with plenty of ambiance. However, I think at times it was almost overly subtle. Tears of the Kingdom builds on the overall sound design and mood of the first game, but also enhances the experience with much more dynamic and sometimes powerful audio. The ambient sound of the world also has a more diverse mix of instruments. Breath of the Wild was dominated heavily by piano and flutes, and in the sequel we do get those, but we also find horns, unique zonai sounds, and other instruments that add a little bit more of an epic or punchy feeling while still retaining that soft ambiance. Major story and world moments more frequently utilize strong choirs and dramatic orchestral pieces. My personal favorite addition is the way that the sound adapts to your situation. For example, in the game's dungeons, the music will grow and build as you grow closer to the end of the challenge and the final boss. Certain quests in this game also follow this pattern, and there are even some clever or cozy side quests based around music that I really enjoyed. The overall sound design here is truly something special, and the only reason I didn't rank this higher is because the original still holds up so well. For number 9, we have technical and graphical improvements. This also sits pretty low on the list since the updates are fairly minor on the surface, but they are smart enhancements that go a long ways. Although the visuals in Tears of the Kingdom look largely the same as Breath of the Wild, there is still much more going on and the scope is much grander. I think the scale of this game has been somewhat underappreciated by mainstream coverage in terms of the visuals. The seamless transitions from the sky to the surface to the depths, the beautiful new sky islands, the larger battles and loads of visual effects, it's all just a miracle on the Switch. Draw distance and overall clarity also seems to be slightly improved. Even if I can't detail every nuance, when I went back and played Breath of the Wild again for comparison, it just looked slightly worse overall. To top it off, the game now runs at an upscaled 1080p versus the original 900p. In my personal experience, I also feel like the game more steadily holds 30 frames per second than the original, in areas like the Korok Forest and some villages that notoriously ran at low frame rates in the first game are noticeably improved here in the sequel. It's by no means perfect, there are still occasional drops when a lot is going on, and the new abilities can certainly cause occasional chug, but overall this game does run smoother, and it presents much more ambitious scenarios. Personally, I still wish this game had been delayed further to leverage the full power of the next system after seeing its grand ambitions, even to release just as a cross-gen title, but what we have here is still a miracle on the ancient Switch hardware. For number 8, we have UI improvements. Now, in my opinion, Breath of the Wild actually had a lot of significant UI issues in terms of managing inventory, weapons, menus, cooking, etc. None of them were deal breakers on their own, but they all added up to sort of a mixed bag of annoyances. Tears of the Kingdom introduces various quality of life improvements to address some of these problems. For example, Breath of the Wild relied on a super awkward horizontal scrolling system in the main menu to move between pages of the same menu section. It also forced you to page all the way through one section to reach the next. This setup has thankfully been replaced with a much more logical vertical scrolling system in Tears of the Kingdom, which makes flipping around the menus much easier. Everything just looks cleaner. There are other improvements all over the place. You can also now drop a weapon while opening a chest if you want to replace it with a superior item when your inventory is full. You can see how much items are worth before you try to sell them. It's easier to see which items Link is holding as you select them. You can also auto-select the ingredients for cooking a recipe by selecting a previously completed dish. The map now has specific coordinates you can reference. Quest lists now tell you your completion percentage by type, and again have removed horizontal scrolling. You can now choose your special abilities using a traditional wheel selector. This feels great, and I wish they had found a way to apply this to other aspects of item selection. For example, I'd rather be limited to 16 or so weapons in order to have them fit on a standard selection wheel instead of horizontally scrolling through up to 25 weapons, which still feels super awkward. The game could slightly boost durability to offset holding fewer weapons and address two issues with one fix. The horizontal selection is still pretty terrible and is actually worse in this game due to the fuse ability, which lets you attach any item in your inventory to an arrowhead. Don't even get me started on the UI for this. Some other glaringly obvious UI opportunities also remain unfulfilled, such as the ability to equip a matching set of armor at once or save specific loadout combinations. Overall, though, the UI is much better this time around, even if some remaining issues keep this lower on the list. Number 7 is quick and a bit hard to explain, but it will make sense if you just play the game. The towns and story-focused areas are simply more dynamic and interactive this time around. Towns have more people and more interesting quests. Story moments often transform these locales in dramatic ways, such as removing severe weather effects or other scenery-changing events. There are entirely new towns in the game, more construction quests, and returning hotspots have been expanded to include new areas and new points of interest. Without getting into spoilers, overall this portion of the game just feels more alive, and it's a welcome change. Let's talk about the story for number 6, or rather not talk about it. Don't worry, no spoilers in this section. Overall, Tears of the Kingdom just has a stronger narrative driving the gameplay momentum. I was never really a fan of Breath of the Wild's story, in all honesty. I thought the divine beasts were a huge miss, and that the cutscenes were very awkward and often dull, and the finale felt a bit hollow from a story perspective due to a faceless boss and lackluster end sequence. I basically ignored the story and just enjoyed the world. Well, with Tears of the Kingdom, the story did keep me interested much more than the original, even if it has a lot of thematic similarities. I actually became motivated to track down and unlock cutscenes, unlike the first game where they felt like an afterthought. The way you go about discovering the story pieces is also less tedious than in Breath of the Wild, and actually kind of fun. The Tears of the Kingdom main quest also delivers more momentum, character interactions, ties into the world around you, and epic moments. Now, the cinematics themselves are still pretty awkward, with questionable voice acting and animation at times, and this is definitely still an area where Nintendo needs to up their game, in my opinion, but overall, the story manages to deliver more interest and energy. For number 5, we have better use of inventory materials. This was something that really annoyed me in the original Breath of the Wild, so I've placed it relatively high on the list. In the original game, it felt like I would endlessly collect items in my inventory, but only ended up using a handful of them in common gameplay. To me, the inventory screen was something I had to shuffle through when I needed to cook or sell something, and little else. Tears of the Kingdom improves this by giving you more uses for your materials. For example, almost any monster part or random item can be fused to a weapon to increase attack power or add extra abilities. At times, this game is more demanding and difficult than its predecessor, so I felt more motivated to create elixirs and cook often. Items related to all the different Zonai devices are useful and serve multiple purposes. Most materials can be attached to arrows for useful enhancements, such as adding frost or fire elements. There are still plenty of items I rarely use, but overall I feel like the majority of my inventory serves multiple purposes, and I found myself missing items I actively wanted to use or stock up on much more often, which is a good sign. Rolling in at number 4, we have weapon durability, which was one of the most controversial aspects of Breath of the Wild. In the original game, weapons would break easily and often, and could only be replaced by finding new ones. There was no fixing or upgrading them. Tears of the Kingdom mostly keeps this system in place, but modifies it with the new Fuse ability, which lets you combine any weapon with a huge number of items from your inventory or even the world at large. Fusing a weapon increases its durability and adds other effects like increased attack power, elemental abilities, and other stat boosts. You can also unfuse and refuse weapons, which enables you to leverage multiple pieces of your inventory on a single weapon. Although fused weapons do have improved durability, they still break fairly easily, and some may still find this annoying, but I had fun trying all the different combinations. Fuse also plays really well with the previous improvements I mentioned in that it adds value and utility to almost all of the items in your inventory and encourages you to collect and experiment with materials. Alright, so to bring in the top 3, let's talk about shrines. Simply put, the shrines in this game are just better for various reasons. Most of the shrines offer more creative or multiple solutions for a desired outcome. This was sometimes possible in Breath of the Wild, but here it feels more intentional. The shrines often encourage experimentation or creative tinkering. The new abilities in the game enable a much wider variety of scenarios and level design. Many shrines also have exterior puzzles out in the main world that can be challenging and offer many potential answers. There are also more shrines in the sequel, which is always welcome. In my opinion, the shrines in Tears of the Kingdom also just look much better visually. Obviously, this is a matter of personal taste, but I was honestly never all that impressed by the appearance of the shrines in the original game, both exterior and interior. The strong navy blues and strange curvature designs never really appealed to me. The shrines in Tears of the Kingdom have a soft sandish color that I think looks really nice and sort of magical when it's occasionally punctuated by color. The exterior stone look is also more simplistic but visually appealing. Overall, the shrines just look and feel a bit more epic. Now landing at number 2, we have sort of a double dip here of Link's new core set of abilities and an improved physics system. It's really impossible to separate the two, so I'm just going to group them. By now, you've probably heard all about these, and they do live up to the hype, but let's recap quick to make a point. With the original Sheikah Slate in Breath of the Wild, we had remote bombs, which allowed you to throw and detonate bombs. We also had stasis, which lets you freeze items temporarily and build up kinetic energy by striking them. There was also kinesis, which let you move items around, and finally the cryonis ability to create ice pillars out of water. Now these abilities were fine, but even just listing them here, you might have noticed that they're all fairly separate from one another and limited in scope. While revisiting Breath of the Wild for comparison, I was surprised at how limited and clunky these abilities felt compared to what we now have in Tears of the Kingdom. The sequel replaces all of these with a brand new set of powers using the upgraded Puripad. We now have Ascend, which lets you morph through surfaces vertically and come out the other side. We also have the heavily marketed Ultra Hand ability, which allows you to combine all kinds of items, materials, and Zonai devices together to build almost anything you can imagine. Then there's Recall to play an item's movement back in time. Finally, we have Fuse, which lets you combine your weapons with countless items and materials, like we discussed earlier. Now the reason I'm listing all of these out here is to highlight that the new abilities have much better synergy with one another and more creative potential. The original abilities in Breath of the Wild were fairly limited in scope, but this new set can be used in so many different scenarios and combined in interesting ways. These abilities are also much more heavily utilized in the broader world of Hyrule. Ascend can be used to climb structures, Ultra Hand can be used for countless purposes, Fuse for combat, and so on. Sometimes in Breath of the Wild, I felt like the abilities were mostly just used inside of shrines or only for puzzles, and didn't always feel completely integrated into the core world experience. That's all been fixed in Tears of the Kingdom, and you'll use these powers constantly. The physics system has also been massively upgraded in Tears of the Kingdom to handle all of these endless possibilities. Makeshift vehicles just work how you imagine they would, and the physics are accurate enough to even play a giant game of Jenga in one of the shrines. Miraculously, in my entire playthrough of the game, I never encountered any bugs or an unexpected behavior. No matter what you throw at this game, the systems somehow all just effortlessly work, and it's something truly special. This is honestly probably the most impressive mechanic system I've seen in a game in years. And now we arrive at number 1. A quick warning that this is probably the most spoilery item on the list. The most significant improvement Tears of the Kingdom delivers over Breath of the Wild is the return to temples and dungeons for the main quest. I can't stress enough how much this deserves to be at the top of the list. Earlier I mentioned that I disliked the Divine Beasts from a story perspective, and that's equally true in terms of gameplay design. The Divine Beasts all looked and felt the same, with a generic bland color palette of murky surfaces. In some ways, I think the Divine Beasts had some interesting puzzle scenarios, such as having to rotate or manipulate large pieces of the environment, but the overall presentation was just so bland and bizarre that I couldn't get invested. They just felt so out of place with the naturalistic design of the rest of the world, and the gameplay inside of them was equally foreign. For example, you strangely can't climb any surfaces inside the Divine Beasts, even though you can climb everything else in the world. Small shrines can get away with this as minor puzzle areas, but the main dungeons should mirror the broader world design and serve as more than just giant shrines. The bosses also look and feel repetitive and are not at all interesting. Tears of the Kingdom marks a bold return to temples. The game even includes the word temple in the name of many of these dungeons, almost like an apology to fans for excluding them previously. These temples fit naturally into the world design and provide such a seamless extension to all the core mechanics that it feels baffling they weren't included in the first game. The temples and their associated characters are also more naturally woven into narrative moments in the story versus the ridiculous idea of divine beast pilots from Breath of the Wild. I also love that the designers did not take away free climbing in these temples like they did with the divine beasts. Instead, they create all kinds of interesting scenarios based on open-ended traversal and Link's unique abilities. There are also more dungeons in the game than there were divine beasts. The main quest is longer and feels more weighty and meaningful with the inclusion of these temples. The temples are also as open-ended as the rest of the game, with multiple solutions to many puzzles that can be completed in almost any order. There are many points in the temples where I was unsure if I was accomplishing something the right way, but that's the whole point. There doesn't have to be one right way. Each temple also ends with a completely unique boss fight, and all of them are better than the ones found in the Divine Beasts, although I still wouldn't put them among the strongest in the franchise. Now, what's also interesting is that the objectives of these temples at the most basic level are actually not that different from what we saw in Breath of the Wild. You're generally trying to remove X number of locks or flip X number of switches, just like you did in the Divine Beasts. You're still not looking for compasses or dungeon maps or special items like in older Zelda games, so they aren't entirely traditional. However, the way you navigate and solve thematic environmental puzzles does feel more like old school Zelda. I feel like these templates are a great update to that old formula to match the gameplay style and design of Tears of the Kingdom. The temples also look and feel great for the most part and feature much stronger designs than any of the Divine Beasts. Overall, it's a great example of what a major impact a difference in presentation and design can deliver on a reused core concept. I also want to highlight that the quests and journeys leading up to entering these temples are much more interesting than in Breath of the Wild. In the first game, you basically just had to find a way onto the beast, which was usually not that difficult or exciting. Tears of the Kingdom offers more interesting and diverse world scenarios leading up to the temple entrances. I won't spoil too much, but there are some cool moments here, which means when you finally reach the temple, you're already excited to be there. So that's my top 10 list. What do you think? Did I miss anything that should definitely be on this list? Do you agree with the order? Leave a comment and let's discuss. Thanks so much for watching, and please hit subscribe to support more content like this.